Hello, it is Friday once again. Thanks for joining me for our live Facebook video. New topics every week. My name is Julie Hirschberg. I am the owner of Reactive Physical Therapy and Wellness, which is a neurologic physical therapy and wellness practice here in the Los Angeles area. And our mission is to really help people with neurologic disorders make great changes in their life through recovering movement, strength, confidence, and in a neuroplastic way, changing the brain. And we do this through PT, OT, exercise, personal training, yoga, and a lot of education and learning with other therapists, which is why I'm joining you here today to talk about the autonomic nervous system. And I don't know about you, but I get obsessed with different parts of the nervous system. It's different every time. I'm looking over here because I've got several books open. Cranial nerves, for example. I've got good old John A. Martin neuroanatomy. I will get obsessed with things. The cerebellum is one of them. The brainstem is one of them. Right now, it's the autonomic nervous system. And it's no surprise because during the last few weeks of a lot of increased stress, a lot of unknown, it's the autonomic nervous system that is kicking in to protect us during this time. It's something, the autonomic nervous system is something that we talk about briefly in the courses that I teach at USC, but it tends to stick to the basics of like the fight or flight or the rest or digest. And there's just so much more. So today is just a little brief intro to that. I think we're going to have many more pieces of this because I've just been diving into my own learning, and I'll share some resources with you today as well. So, today we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, starting with the anatomy, of course, my favorite neuroanatomy, the ever important vagus nerve, which is why I've had my cranial nerve book out here. If you look at some of the vagus nerve pieces of it, it's just outstanding. Why the autonomic nervous system is so important for people with neurologic disorders, why we need to attend to it, the basics, just the very tip of the iceberg of screening and testing the autonomic nervous system in practice, and then how can we include it into treatment. So we've got a lot to do. Let's start with the neuroanatomy. So let's go kind of big picture and then narrow down a little bit. So the autonomic nervous system, we do have to think of the central control pieces. So if you just take an example of some kind of threat happening. So you are out hiking and you hear rustling. This has happened to me, and it's a bear. So you have all of these unconscious processes that respond. So you have the amygdala um, in the brain recognizing the threat. For example, sending impulses to the hypothalamus, initiating some of those neuroendocrine responses, brainstem nuclei activating. And then those will actually go out to the periphery, out to our viscera to make changes to keep us safe. This is where that fight or flight comes in. Are we going to fight the bear? Are we going to run really fast? Something also to think about is it may actually cause a freeze, and it's this freeze that sometimes I can really see in a person that I'm working with. They may be stuck, and I don't mean Parkinson's freezing, by the way, but they may be stuck in a state of being disassociated from the body, for example, as a mechanism of survival. But we also see the fight or flight aspect of that. And that, as we think of going from, okay, so we went from like cortex, amygdala, limbic system, hypothalamus, brainstem nuclei. Some of my favorite nuclei in the brainstem are part of the autonomic nervous system, by the way. Just a little shout out to the Edinger Westphal nucleus. We see descending control. So much like the motor system, we see descending control, and we see specific nuclei of the vagus, like the dorsal motor nucleus of the vagus, for example. We see the spinal nuclei that are in the intermedial lateral horn of the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord, for example. And then so there is that direct piece, but there's so much interconnection and communication to mediate the responses. So, for example, if I am going to work out, there's some communication happening through the autonomic system. The viscera, the somatic motor symptoms are going to start shuttling blood flow so I can have increased muscle activity and exertion. And we can't ignore that and how that might play out with our patients who have neurologic disorders or are greatly influenced in the autonomic nervous system, and may even have an autonomic nervous system disorder. So that's kind of the basic part of the anatomy. I will say that there is a whole lot more. And I have a couple of great, I have more than a couple. I have so many great resources. I have several sitting in front of me here, things that I've just been diving into. I think I mentioned last week, just looking for my book here, because I have so many, was The Widen the Window. Oh, it's sitting under my computer here. Widen the Window by Elizabeth Stanley. A great resource in exploring the autonomic nervous system a little bit more. And then I have a couple of recent books that I've been reading are The Polyvagal Theory in Therapy by Deb Dana. And then she also, this is a newer book, but Polyvagal Exercises for Safety and Connection, which do have some physical activities that I think are really helpful to incorporate into practice. But if you want to dive in to looking at the polyvagal theory part of the autonomic nervous system understanding, I highly recommend these resources. And maybe we'll do another live to talk about those as well. So we talked about central control, peripheral with the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And when we think of basic functions, we think of sympathetic, fight or flight. We think of parasympathetic, rest and digest. We can also think of sleep, reproduction, recovery of our organs. And the vagus nerve is the big piece of this in the parasympathetic system. The vagus nerve is huge, by the way. It's actually 75% of the whole peripheral nervous system, which is quite amazing. And its huge function is in parasympathetic. And as I was just to appreciate this a little bit, let me just show you one of the pictures from my favorite cranial nerve book. But if you just kind of look at the orange there, that is all just one part of the vagus nerve. So we look at this homeostasis in the organs as a big function of our autonomic nervous system. And in general, what we think of is that this is automatic control, not conscious. But what we also understand is that there are pieces that we can consciously control and change. So, one of the biggest take homes that I think about with the autonomic nervous system is that we can't ignore some of the complex interactions from the central nervous system, the brain, the limbic system, the endocrine system, as well as the immune system on our autonomic nervous system and vice versa. So we see this interplay a lot in neurologic disorders. So this brings us to our second point, is why is this so important for neurologic disorders? So first of all, it might be the neurologic disorder, right? So we work with people with POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardic syndrome, and this is indeed an autonomic disorder where the person has really severe orthostatic changes, heart rate changes in response to gravity. So that's one reason why testing and treating in the autonomic nervous system is so important, because it might actually be the disorder. And the second, though, and maybe is not as clear cut, is how the autonomic nervous system influences other neurologic disorders. We might see a direct piece of it in Parkinson's disease, for example, where there's autonomic dysfunction. We might see autonomic neuropathies, or we see that increased sympathetic nervous system output and drive worsens people's neurologic symptoms. So, for example, we might see increased spasticity when the person is in a sympathetic state. We might see worsened tremor. We might see worsened functional disorders. The person might be more dizzy. They might have severe ringing in the ears. And these all really then play into their functional difficulties. So the autonomic nervous system kind of overlays it, it puts a layer on top of nervous system dysfunction. Another, and I can't forget to say this, another direct effect is on pain. And we know that with increased sympathetic activity, there is actually an excitability in some of the nociceptive nerve fibers and in the central nervous system that can lead and worsen centralized pain as well. So, so many reasons for us to look at it and examine it. And I think for myself in my own practice, this is a newer area to actually test it. Now, I'll start with some of the things that are really easy to implement. And I think we're all doing this. And the very first is to listen to the person's story. Where are there some hints of autonomic nervous system dysfunction? They may be saying, hey, I feel really on edge. I feel like I startle quickly. I've had people even say, I feel like my fight or flight is constantly on. I feel like I'm in danger. I'm scared. Those types of things would tell us and hint to us about the sympathetic nervous system. Some other things that we might notice or hear would be their pupil size. Are their pupils really dilated? Are they really constricted? Do they have clammy skin, changes in skin temperature or sensitivity to that? Do they have a racing heart rate frequently, or if that's something that they report? So those are small things. We might even see Horner's syndrome, for example, and we'd want to screen for that. That's that triad where typically a sympathetic ganglion is involved, where you see ptosis, meiosis, and hydrosis. So those would be some autonomic signs. Some of the things that we're starting to look at doing and measuring in our practice is heart rate variability. So this is something that is typically tested like first thing in the morning, and you want really good or high heart rate variability. Um, and we actually have we're trying out a couple of different monitors, so to be continued. I'd love to hear from you if this is something that that you're measuring. But this is one particular objective outcome measure that you can use to see if heart rate variability is changing with some of the practices that you're looking to implement to change the autonomic nervous system. When we particularly look for screening for POTS and testing that as well, we might do a standing test, like the 10-minute standing test. There's also something called the NASA lean test. Both of these are really nicely described in the literature. So I'll put in a couple links if you're not sure about those. We would do a graded exercise test and look at heart rate recovery. So heart rate recovery is another measuring that's another way to look at autonomic activity. And we would then do exercise and then look to see if heart rate improves in that first, second, and um, third minute post post exercise. And again, I have another full text article here that I'll put in the comments for you that goes through the heart rate recovery as a measurement. Because I think for a lot of us, this is not something we learned in school. And it's really, frankly, a new area for me, for us at Reactive, to be testing, treating more and more. So I think there's other pieces out there that other people have used, like temperature and breath assessments, that I still want to explore myself. And if you're using some of these, I'd love to hear from you, by the way. Okay, so we've got to know it's important, we've got to measure it, and then finally, how do we incorporate this into our sessions as PTs and OTs? And I think that very first piece is to move into awareness. So the autonomic nervous system is set up to be unconscious and moving on without us. And sometimes we can get stuck. I've been there, stuck in a sympathetic state. And awareness is the first step to move out of that. Um, I have found the mindfulness-based strategies and techniques very helpful for this. Sometimes they can be too much and overwhelming, and this is where working very closely with a therapist to help move through some of these pieces of awareness might be really good, a great part of an interdisciplinary team. Um, Working on breath, and especially a controlled breath, diaphragmatic breath, extended exhale breath. Box breathing is another technique that we would use for the autonomic system. Yoga is a huge piece. So working with our yoga therapists can really be a nice way to tone the autonomic nervous system. Working through graded fitness, graded exercise, graded aerobic activity. Sometimes this has to be very, very slow. So in the case of POTS, for example, but even in the absence of POTS, we may have to move through graded exercise, graded aerobic activity slowly for the autonomic nervous system to have an appropriate response. And this is a really nice one, and this has brought me a lot of joy recently. But getting outside, getting in nature has been a very important piece of autonomic nervous system toning for myself. But it also is part of mindfulness practices as well. I can tell you for sure, the last 3 months of being in a pandemic, the last couple of weeks being through a lot of emotional turmoil and things happening in our country, I think a lot of us had really elevated sympathetic nervous systems, myself included. And some of the pieces for me, it's getting out to the ocean, getting in the water. Surfing actually is a really great activity. I'm not saying let's prescribe surfing for everybody, but for me, I have been surfing almost every day for the last couple of weeks, and it has completely changed my nervous system and how easily I might be in a fight or flight response. I think that threshold is higher. And I think that's what a lot of people find when they are able to tone the autonomic system, is that they're less likely to flip into the fight or flight and hang out in a safe zone, in a joyful, socially connected zone. So there you have it. We went through a very basic level of autonomic nervous system anatomy and the ever important vagus nerve, why it's important to people with neurologic disorders, the real basic ideas of screening and testing function, and then how we can train and tone it, how we can start to do that. I did mention last week about grounding. So the grounding technique is actually from this author, Elizabeth Stanley, The Wide in the Window. And we put it just in a little easy to use step-by-step way of a sitting um, contact point grounding technique. So this is available. I'll put a link there, free to download. I've been using it a lot myself, and I've been using it with a lot of people that I work with this week. So thanks for joining me on this journey of my current obsession with the autonomic nervous system. And I hope you can find some places of rest and safety this week and weekend. And I will see you next week.